Next week, Batman versus Mr. Freeze. Next week, Batman versus Zelda the Great. Next week, Batman versus the Joker. Next week, Batman meets the Mad Hatter. Next week, the Joker returns. Next week, Batman battles Falseface. Next week, Batman faces the Catwoman. Next week, the return of the Penguin. Next week, return match with the Riddler. Next week, Batman jousts with the Joker again. Next week, King Tut tangles with a dynamic duo. Next week, the dynamic duo versus the Bookworm. Next week, the return of the Riddler. Next week, the Penguin waddles again. Next week, Batman faces the Catwoman. Next week, Batman faces the Catwoman. Next week, the dynamic duo meets the Minstrel. Next week, another battle royal with King Tut. Next week, Batman and Robin meet the greatest mother of them all. Next week, the dynamic duo meets the Clock King. Next week, Batman and Robin versus Egghead. Next week, Batman challenged by Chandel. Next week, the Penguin waddles again. Next week, Mr. Freeze returns. Next week, rematch, Batman versus the Joker. Carolyn Jones as Marcia, Queen of Diamonds, faces Batman. Next week, Cliff Robertson as Shame corrals the Caped Crusaders. Next week, Burgess Meredith with a new Penguin ploy. Next week, Maurice Evans as the Puzzler versus Batman. Next week, Michael Rennie as the Sandman teams up with the Catwoman. Next week, David Wayne returns as the Mad Hatter. Next week, a Batman special, the first installment of an action-packed three-parter in which the Joker and the Penguin team up against the Caped Crusaders. Don't miss the start of the hostilities, Bat fans. Next week, same Bat time, same Bat channel. Tomorrow, the catastrophic return of Julie Newmar as the Catwoman. Tomorrow, another Batman special. The Penguin and Marcia, Queen of Diamonds, versus the Caped Crusaders in the first of 3 exciting parts. Same Bat time, same Bat channel. Next week, John Astin as the Riddler battles Batman. Next week, Cesar Romero returns as the Joker. Next week, Julie Newmar springs back as the Catwoman. Next week, Batman and Robin clash with the Green Hornet and Kato. Next week, Victor Buono returns as King Tut. Next week, Miss Tallulah Bankhead locks horns with Batman. Next week, Cesar Romero returns as the Joker. Next week, Eli Wallach as the frigid Mr. Freeze.